And then, good evening.
Good evening. Hello.
Can we try this again? Good evening.
Good evening.
Yay, you're awake. I'm lucky. I grew up within the walls of the First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, the largest humanist society in the world and the birthplace of religious humanism. It was there my family landed in 1968, and I was 2, so do the math, when searching for a like-minded community, a community similar to what they found in Birmingham, Michigan at the Unitarian Church. An open-minded, non-theistic group of individuals highlighting liberal and progressive values and principles. I'm lucky. I grew up humanist, surrounded by kind, caring, and unique individuals who not only danced to their own tune but celebrated it loudly. Individuals who dared to let go of religious traditions of their childhood to embrace a life without God. A life focused on intentionally doing the best and being the best individuals they could be. Living to their fullest, taking advantage of opportunities and paving the way for a greater humanity. I have many stories of these inspiring individuals who made up the First Unitarian Society's community during the 70s, 80s, and well into the 90s. Stories involving Sunday afternoon potluck cross-country ski trips, gourmet dinner clubs, Saturday morning pancake breakfasts, weekends at a cabin or at a farm, and weeks spent at Camp Unistar, which is a family camp that's primarily humanist, in northern Minnesota. This community was my safe haven, where I did not need to explain or debate my beliefs or the lack of belief. That's what I'm trying to get out. It was where I learned valued life lessons, morals and ethics, how to treat others, how to care for myself, what it means to be in relationships. Why is it important to be part of something? In essence, what is community? It is hard to put into words what exactly it was like growing up in this humanist community. As a child, the active members were as bright as the colors of a kaleidoscope and just as varied in their changing shapes and sizes. There are too many interesting characters that had a significant impact on me to share with you today, but if I may, I'll indulge in telling you about one man who shaped not only my life, but many lives within our community. Ross, at over 6 feet tall, would have been an intimidating figure if it had not been for his warm smile and quiet demeanor. Ross was humble, inventive engineer with a quick wit and a determined spirit. He'd actually worked on the Apollo space shuttle, which I didn't know until I went to his memorial service, so he was very humble in his accomplishments. Nothing was too challenging or insurmountable to Ross. On his hobby farm, he found many creative solutions for those pesky little problems. Squirrels on your bird feeder? No worry. Ross created the squirrel-a-whirl. This was a self-cocking arm on the bird feeder, and he had a remote control. So when the squirrels would get on the bird feeder, he'd get this kind of sick smile on his face as he pressed the remote control, and the self-cocking arm would come up and fling the squirrels like 20 feet. And he'd just laugh. He thought that was so great. Need to chop wood for a fire? Ross created the wood chopper's chum. That made splitting logs easy and efficient. There were many more of these mechanisms all over the farmhouse. My favorite was that he had this, what we called the hip knob, and it was at the sink. So if you were rinsing dishes, all you had to do was push your hip against this knob. The water would come on and you just rinse the dishes. That was my favorite. It was pretty eco-friendly and very practical. Ross was an inspiration in many ways, beyond just his creative inventions. He motivated people to truly celebrate life and embrace each other. He helped integrate a prominent Minneapolis neighborhood with African exchange students and walked the Soul Patrol in northern Minneapolis to help diffuse racial tensions in the 60s. He held sensitive male festivals, New Year's Eve's parties, tennis tournaments, cross-country ski weekends, and croquet bashes, uniting our community on his farm. From Ross, I gained the courage to be myself. I learned to push harder, never to give up, and always to find the good in others. He taught me the importance of friendship and the art of giving selflessly. That there is true joy in bringing out the best in others, and certainly in finding those creative solutions. He brought me and many others together in our humanist community. A community that understood how to embrace people's strengths, knew the value of cooperative participation, and the importance of sharing a respectful purpose toward a greater good. Now, more than ever, it is critical we come together in solidarity, holding firm to support our values and principles. It's time we set aside our egos, selfish desires that distance ourselves from our fellows, keeping us from connecting with each other. We should follow Ross's example, celebrating our humanity, our unique individuality, our humanness. It is time we really listen to one another. Reach for compassion and understanding, not just be in our heads, but in our hearts, which I talked a lot about today at our building community, that we sometimes live too much in our head and not enough from our hearts. We need to look for ways we can support each other in being our best for not only our sake, but the sake of our community, for it is within community we find the strengths, the answers to life's problems. Let's put our values in action, shall we? And join together in community. It's time. It's time we work together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kristin. I'm so grateful for your story that you shared and all the work that you've done to support community and humanist education. And thank you, August, for the introduction, although how dare you let these wonderful people know that I used to be cool, used to wear skinny jeans, now I'm wearing daddy khakis, so thanks a lot. Don't Google daddy khakis, you'll find some stuff you might not want to see. Good evening, everyone. Are we going to do it again? Woo! Good evening, everyone. Woo! All right, I got a couple woos. I'm here for that. I'm so grateful to be here with you all tonight. I haven't been at an SSA conference in more years than I'd like to divulge, so it's really, really great to be back. We had such a wonderful session this morning and afternoon on building community, and I'm feeling really inspired by everything that everyone who was there shared. I'm here to talk about community, something that is definitely on my mind, not just after the community building training that Kristin and I facilitated, but as I begin work on a new project in Minnesota, and I got there just about a month ago. And I'm working with a number of humanist organizations and communities in Minnesota to explore what it might look like to establish a Center for Humanist Life in Minnesota, a hub for non-religious community and action in the heart of the country. So with the support of those groups, I recently stepped down from my position at Yale and moved back to work on the project. And as I've been talking with people in Minnesota, friends, family about this move, I have people sort of asking what a humanist center would do, what it would be about, why a humanist center at all. And this is something I've thought about for years while working in the secular movement, because I've watched as a number of my fellow atheists and humanists have excitedly championed the news that more and more Americans are identifying as non-religious, and I agree, there's a lot about that is exciting. But while many of my colleagues are very excited, as someone who's spent the better part of a decade now working with young non-religious Americans at Harvard and at Yale, I'm actually pretty concerned when I think about this trend. Because I worry that the growing number of non-religious people, and especially non-religious young people, including many of the folks that I've worked with over the years and others I've met in my travels around the country, I worry that they won't have communities to turn to in times of crisis and need, or spaces where they can interact with and learn from people who can inspire and challenge them. People like in the story that Kristin shared, who can encourage them and support them to engage with questions of meaning and purpose. This concern is a big part of why I've spent my adult life advocating for and working to build these kinds of communities, spaces where non-religious people can interact with one another, find support, and connect with like-minded others. For me, the need for this kind of resource feels deeply personal. I grew up in Minnesota in a non-religious family, but I converted to Christianity when I was around 11 because I was looking for a community of support and a space to explore the big questions of life, and I found that in Christianity, in my community. Unfortunately, the church that I joined was very theologically conservative and deeply homophobic, and shortly after converting, I realized that I was queer, and that inspired an immense struggle for me that went on for a number of years. And in hindsight, I wish that I would have found instead a humanist community like the First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, where Kristin found a space where she could be herself and connect with other non-religious and non-theistic folks. A community where I would have been welcomed and accepted as I was, and not have had to try to wrap my mind around beliefs that didn't make sense to me, just to get the benefits that came with being a part of that community. But fortunately, after years of struggling with that and suffering through an intense personal and private struggle around my sexual orientation, my mother learned of what I was experiencing, and she helped me come to terms with my sexual orientation and find a supportive community, and I'm forever grateful for that. Eventually, while studying religion at a college in Minnesota, I realized that, in fact, I was an atheist, and that I had really become a Christian for the community and not for the theology. And so after college, I decided to continue my studies and try to figure out what it would look like to build humanist communities, to build spaces where non-religious and secular people could explore their values together and act on them. And I've really enjoyed working to build those communities over the years. Working at Harvard and Yale introduced me to incredible students and young people like my friend Chelsea Blink, who is a Yale PhD candidate in the history of science and medicine at Yale, who was an undergraduate at Harvard when I was there, and whose wedding I officiated when she and her husband changed their last names from Bowen and Link to Blink, which I think is pretty amazing. And she expresses the need for non-religious communities really clearly, I think. She says, "Many people go to a church or a synagogue to be inspired, to ask hard philosophical and ethical questions, to reflect on the big picture, to seek guidance and comfort in difficult times, to celebrate holidays and life milestones, and to join with like-minded people in community service. But non-religious people like me often miss out on those things because we don't subscribe to the theology that goes with it. So I'm very excited to belong to the Yale Humanist community because it means that I don't have to choose between my beliefs and my values." Without the support of an institution to ground and connect them to a community and an identity, people like Chelsea and many other non-religious people that I've worked with over the years will miss out on many of the opportunities that their religious peers have for personal development and civic engagement. And sure enough, there's emerging data that shows that religious people in this country are much more civically engaged. They vote more. Christians have a voter registration rate that's 3 times higher than the non-religious do. They're much more involved in their broader communities. But there's also emerging data from an organization called Interfaith Youth Corps in Chicago, which I used to work for, that shows that when students who are secular are given an identity and an opportunity to find resources and support, they become much more civically engaged. And so I believe that giving students access to the kinds of resources that their religious peers often have will make a really big difference. And I think this is perhaps particularly true for young people and college and university students, because when I was an undergraduate and realized that I was not religious, I felt very isolated. My religious peers had chaplains and communities, spaces they could turn to, groups they could get involved in, and I really felt like I couldn't talk to anyone about my changing beliefs, my challenging experiences, and my emerging values. I felt disconnected and without a community during an important time of personal growth and development. And I think about that isolating feeling today whenever I meet with community members, and it reminds me how important it is that all people, including the non-religious, have access to those kinds of resources and to a caring community where they can be themselves. So as people debate why it is that 1/4 of Americans, including 1/3 of people under the age of 30, which is a group I don't belong to anymore, I just realized for the first time. Okay, so as people debate why... Daddy khakis. So as people debate why it is that more and more people are becoming non-religious, I think there's actually a more pressing question. Not the why, but the where. Where are these religiously unaffiliated Americans finding community, connection, support, and inspiration? And in particular, where are the large percentage of religiously unaffiliated individuals who specifically say that they're not looking for or interested in finding a religious community, finding those resources? I think that those folks deserve to have access to a space where they can be open and honest about who they are, connect with others, find support, consider life's big questions, and be challenged to act on their values. Which is why we want to explore building a humanist center in Minnesota. While many atheists and humanists will find community on campus, we all have to graduate eventually, theoretically.
Yeah.
And while some will end up in UU communities, as Kristin did, there are many others, people like me, who will never walk in the doors of UU congregation. We just don't feel like that is a space for us. And I think that those people deserve to have a community as well. So as we're thinking about what it would look like to open a humanist center, we want to reach out to those folks and find out what they're looking for in a community. So the Humanist Center of Minnesota is still very early in the way that we're thinking about it, but it's going to work in conjunction with these existing well-established humanist communities and organizations, like the First Unitarian Society, as well as the Humanists of Minnesota, and other atheist and secular groups in the state, to explore new ways of building and being in community. So in partnership with those humanist groups, as well as a number of colleges and universities in the area, we're going to draw upon the organizational strengths of these existing groups and bring forth new opportunities for gathering and connecting as community. And we hope set precedents for the growth and expansion of humanism as a widely accepted life stance. I believe that a collaboration like the one emerging between these groups, where all these different secular groups are coming together and working together, can represent a new path forward for humanist communities. Because I think we have an opportunity to form unprecedented collaborative partnerships where these well-established existing humanist communities who have been doing really important, good work for many years can learn from one another and work together and learn from these emerging new forms of community like campus groups, and what helps support more and more young non-theists, especially as they graduate from college and look for communities that they can get involved in beyond their time as a student. But this will only happen if these groups work together. There's a quote that I love from JFK, well, from one of JFK's speechwriters, which is that a rising tide lifts all ships. But I'm trying to switch to using a Minnesotan reference now that I'm in Minnesota, which is Paul Wellstone. Everyone there loves him so much. And he said, we all do better when we all do better. And I think that our communities, we do important different things, our different secular and humanist and non-religious communities. But I think we can do those things better if we work together and learn from one another to explore new ways of being in community. So I'm really looking forward to exploring those ways as we explore what it looks like to build a humanist center. Because I hope that moving forward, more and more young humanists, more and more young non-religious people like me, when I was much younger, will be able to find communities that align with their existing values rather than having to end up in spaces that are not good for them, that don't align with the things that they believe. And I hope that with these communities emerging, we can support the expansion of such communities all over the US and around the world, because I think we need them now more than ever. Thank you very much.
I think I'm being given the yes, we have time for some questions.
Okay, sweet. Kristin, do you want to come back up here? Differently cute. Differently cute. Oh, this is so much louder now. Wow, sorry everyone. Yeah, so do we have any questions? Who are we pointing at? Yeah. You point. I'm still not clear. In the back?
Yeah, her. How would you approach an area like Utah, for say, example, where the religion is very, very prevalent and there's kind of not as much of a separation of church and state? What about, like, what can you do for communities like that?
Yeah, so I've observed a phenomenon, and I'm sure others can speak to it even more than I can, but that in a lot of areas like that, the need for communities like this is actually even that much greater. I mean, one of the things that I feel really excited about is when I was working at Harvard and Yale, I mean, the majority of incoming students identified as atheist or agnostic or secular. And while I think we did provide an important resource, moving back to Minnesota, it's a different landscape. I mean, Minnesota is a progressive state for the Midwest, but I do think that, you know, in places where religion has a lot more influence, making sure that secular folks have a community where they can be themselves is really critical. And over the years, I've gotten to travel around and visit places like Mobile, Alabama, for example, visiting the Secular Student Alliance group there, and they're doing really vital work for people who live in a part of the country where they feel like they cannot really be open about who they are in a lot of spaces. So it requires a different approach depending on where you are, but I think the work is so critical there.
There actually is a group in Utah called the Humanist Mormons, and they're approaching it in a way that they're trying to, much like the humanist Jews, and keeping their ethnicity while moving away from the dogma and the doctrine. So I think what Chris said is finding different ways to transcend in those communities without alienating.
Yeah, and recognizing that in different parts of the country, you're going to have, each community is going to look different depending on where it is. Yeah, but ours is going to have a Minnesota flavor, but others are going to need other flavors. We'll probably have to have potlucks.
That's what Al Franken does.
Is that what Al Franken does?
Yeah, he has every year he has a contest in Minnesota amongst the senators for the best potluck dish or the best casserole. And I think it was, who won that? We don't
call it a casserole.
Hot dish.
We call it a hot dish. It's called a hot dish in Minnesota, for the record.
Yeah,
and
hot dish.
my hot dish is terrible. I'm gonna have to work on that. Do we have a, yeah. Where are we pointing? Excellent. Wow, but my eyesight, not what it used to be. Sorry.
Thank you. No, I thought it's a. Did you guys want to talk? I have a question. I have a question too, so it's okay. I'm so glad you gave the talk about building that community, and I'm going to give my game away by saying community space. That's one of the only ways I can think to answer that, to finish that sentence. And of course, there's so much more to it than that. But I'll ask about that. One of the most inspiring things to picture for me is some of the fabulous facilities that I've seen either in religious communities or the very secular Jewish community center that I enjoy in Pittsburgh, for instance. And so anything you want to say about how that's part of the mission and how to get there?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I mean, when we were doing programs at Yale and at Harvard, one thing that I found was that making sure that you were meeting in the same space every time and having that consistency so that people didn't have to figure out, oh, which room is the meeting in this time. I mean, that it seems really simple, but it makes a big difference. But it's different to rent out a space somewhere versus having your own space that you can do things with and that people can walk into and feel like they're stepping into a space that exists for a specific purpose. So we definitely want to work toward that. We're fortunate because First Unitarian Society is this flagship humanist community center. They have an amazing location. It's right in the heart of Minneapolis. They're doing all these upgrades to the building right now. And, you know, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. We're still having lots of conversations with these different groups, but one possible outcome is that this First Unitarian Society eventually becomes the humanist center as the congregational model is sort of dying for a lot of mainline traditions. Yeah.
The current minister, David Breeden, is also the dean of the Humanist Institute. So the three of us are kind of collaborating on this project. And David very much talks about religious humanism now becoming congregational humanism, and that whole idea of congregation is going away. So his excitement about us doing this project of this humanist center is that hopefully he can transcend his building into his bricks and mortars that have been there for 100 years into this totality humanist center and not just a place where people meet for Sunday assembly. So he's excited about sort of giving over some of this space to us, and so it's lively.
Yeah, and it's important, I think, to think about these things, because I brought my younger brother, who's an atheist, to First Unitarian Society on some Sundays, and he loves the content. He's like, this is totally in line with the way that I think. And he's, on Sundays he hasn't gone, he's listened to the podcast that they do of the sort of talk that happens on Sunday. But he has said to me, you know, it's a building that has pews. Right? They have pews, they have hymnals, it sort of looks like a church, and those things might seem superficial, but for a lot of folks, those things can be really alienating. And so thinking about what it would look like to transform that space so that it was truly a secular space and felt like a sort of secular humanist space, I think those are a lot of conversations that have to be had.
They're taking the pews out.
Oh, thank goodness. They're uncomfortable for starters. These chairs, much better.
Yay, all right, so Liz, there was one other person. Okay, yeah, you. Last question, Harry. I'll have to figure out things in here.
Where were we? Here?
Cool, thanks for the opportunity. Do you ever think that in this congregational humanism that you're envisioning, there could be a sort of symbology or rituals that are similar to rituals formed in religion? For example, like the hymns and the singing the song before the pastor comes up and speaks, and praying is another ritual that religions do. Do you think there could be an equal symbolism in secularism?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, we're ritualistic creatures. When I get up in the morning, I have to have a cup of coffee. I look at Twitter. Unfortunately, these days, looking at Twitter, not as fun as it used to be. You know, but the problem is when you walk in, part of what's powerful about the rituals in a religious tradition is you walk in, and even if they do them sort of differently, there are things that feel familiar. It sort of connects you to this broader tradition. We don't really have that in humanism, but I do think that thinking about what it would look like to create, and certainly a number of humanist communities are doing this. We did it at Yale. We had something before each speaker called a moment of reflection, where someone got up and did a reading that they chose, a member of the community that was related to the topic. And after each speaker, we had something called the moment of connection, where another member of the community got up, shared a personal story, and then invited people to turn to one another and reflect on a question related to the topic together. And even those really simple rituals created a sort of feeling when we got together on Sundays that, you know, when you came on a Sunday, you sort of knew what to expect, and there were these opportunities to sort of orient you to the space and get you thinking and talking and connecting with other people. And that's really, I mean, what ritual at its best does. It creates opportunities to reflect, to have a sort of check-in moment with yourself or with people around you. And I certainly think, you know, ritual doesn't have to be coercive, it doesn't have to be dogmatic. We can reimagine ritual and think about what it would look like in a humanist way. And unfortunately, all of our communities right now that are doing those things are sort of recreating the wheel, each in their own space. So we're really working hard to try to get communities talking to each other more and sharing more resources.
I think Chris and I are trying very hard not to make assumptions about what this is going to look like, and spending the first year trying to figure out what is it that people need from community, how do they define community, and how then do we meet those needs in a way that doesn't smack of religion and make people run out the back door, but really hits them in the head and the heart. As I talked about in my talk, it's time for us to focus on compassion and not so much on our heads. So that's where we're at.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much, everyone.